I'm Sarah from The Upcoming. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to speak to you about this wonderful production. Maybe for people who don't know anything about it, you could give us a brief introduction to The Straw Chair.
Straw Chair is a play written by Sue Glover. It was written in the 1980s, and this is the first production of it in England. It tells the story of chiefly two women. One is Isabel, who's just married, age 17, and goes with her new husband, a minister, to the island of St Kilda, which is now occupied solely by birds, but was then occupied by a small population. And when she reaches there, she meets Rachel Grange, who was married to an extremely important law lord in Scotland, Lord Grange, and who tried his patience so severely that he had her abducted and abandoned on a sequence of islands. Actually, St Kilda was only one of the islands where she spent her time. It's an extraordinary story of which I knew absolutely nothing growing up in Scotland, and I should have done, really. The first I'd heard of Rachel Grange was when I was asked about 10 years ago to record some of her letters. She managed to smuggle letters off the island, which is a greater barrier than you might imagine, because she was surrounded by people who didn't speak her language. And although I'm sure she eventually came to at least a nodding understanding of what they were saying, isolation was very much the point of the exercise. And it was more than their lives were worth to assist her in making any attempt to be rescued. However, I was hired to read her letters, and she is an extraordinarily vibrant, I think is the word we use these days, character. She leaps off the page in her letters. You have a very strong sense of exactly who she is and what it would be like to spend time with her. She was a notoriously difficult woman, although we have to bear in mind that most accounts of her were written by people who were not the least bit sympathetic to her plight. But she was famously difficult. And the story interests me for two reasons, really. Firstly, the link between madness, sadness, and badness is one which is always worth exploring. We're very quick, historically, and even now, to assume that women who are not demure, who express themselves forcefully, are borderline, here's that word again, hysterical, or of dubious sanity. So that interests me, looking at that. And also the fact that, as is revealed in her letters, one of which is read in part at the end of this play, she never gave up hope of perhaps some kind of better future. And that's a characteristic which has been quite hard for me personally to summon up over the last few years, certainly. And I think for increasing numbers of us to feel at home with. So I really wanted to do it when I was asked, and I'm very glad for the opportunity to do it. It's an extraordinary story. Mm. And what Sue has done is show you two other characters apart from Isabel and Rachel. Una, who is the islander whose job it is to try and manage Rachel's life and to make her as comfortable as possible and keep her as safe and contained as she can. And Isabel's husband, Aeneas Seaton, who, because he's a man and because he is a minister and a respected person in any society in which he moves, has perhaps more power than the women do, but who comes to realise throughout the course of the story that actually his fate too is absolutely subject to the whims of a few very powerful men who are much higher up the food chain than he is.
And you mentioned there, so it's the first time this play has actually been, staged in England. So was that also something that excited you, and to be able to bring that story to an audience that probably won't have seen it before or heard of it before?
Yeah, well, I mean, I grew up in Scotland, and I didn't know anything about this woman's story until I was in my early 50s. It also interests me, the work of, I am familiar with some of Sue's other work. For some reason, I can't remember what I was doing in 1988. There was a good reason why I didn't see this play, because a friend of mine, an actress whose work I admire very much, Anne Lacey, played the part that I'm now playing in its original production. and I would love to have seen her do it. I didn't see it then, but as I say, I am familiar with some of Sue's work. I know she's a very fine writer, but also I am now 62. Sue is perhaps older than I am. I would suggest that she wouldn't mind me saying that. And this is a good time to be an older woman. It's not all moonbeams and roses, but it's a lot better now than it ever has been. And it interests me as a woman who won't see 21 again, to do the work of another woman who won't see 21 again, about predominantly a middle-aged woman who has outlived her usefulness and who is summarily treated because of it.
Mm-hmm. And what was it like working with Polly as a director and on this particular production with a fellow cast?
Absolutely delightful. Of course, everyone looks to me as if they're 12, and many of them actually are. Polly's not 12, but she's not that much older. She's certainly nearer 12 than I am, but she runs a very tight, well-organised and warm rehearsal room. And many people I've worked with who are a great deal older, and by virtue of that more experienced than she is, don't do that. So big thumbs up for Polly Creed.
And what about the theatre itself? I mean, it's quite an intimate space. How does that perhaps impact the way you put on a production? I mean, you know, rather than being kind of on a larger stage with a larger auditorium.
Yeah, it's there are pros and cons, but I think the pros, for me anyway, far outweigh the cons. I like being in the same room as an audience. I always have. And whether I'm an audience member or a performer. And what it really does is mean that you have to be, which all actors are always trying to be anyway, you have to be as truthful in execution as you possibly can be. If something that you might have been able to do in a bigger stage is not going to work in a space this size, then you have to just can it and find something that does work. And I think it's really exciting to be that close to a story being told in front of you. I'm sure that it's difficult for some audience members. Like I said, Rachel is a really difficult woman. She's very angry, and angry women are something that we all have difficulty in dealing with. Angry people are not easy to deal with, but angry women are particularly scary. And, you know, to honour what Sue has written, I have to hit them with the full force of that right from the get-go. And they see other sides to her because she's an extremely changeable quantity, Rachel. But it requires a lot of nerve, both from me and from the audience, to just go with that and see where it takes us all. And I am really grateful to people who are willing to do that, because I know it's not an easy proposition. The other characters are all lovely. You have a much nicer time with them.
And in terms of having to perform that, you know, do you have like a process for yourself? Do you have to kind of psych yourself up before you go on stage? Do you have to kind of take, you know, your rest breaks in between to kind of recharge? How do you cope with it?
Well, I sort of think that, you know, it's not worth doing unless it's worth doing with everything that you've got. And obviously, everybody has better days at work than others. And actors are just the same. The difference between us and most other people is that, you know, people pay for us to be having a really good day at work. So that's what we always try to do. Rachel is interesting because it's debatable how sane she is by the point at which the play starts. It's also, she's manipulative too. And you would be if you were fighting for your life. So there are times when she is playing and there are times when she's not. And it's interesting for me to find out where all those little pointers are. I have a kind of get out of jail card because we can't say whether or not the woman in this play is entirely in possession of her senses at any given moment. She has periods of clarity. But what is really interesting to play is that it seems to me obvious that because she is desperately lonely, but very proud at the beginning of the play, and those things don't change much, but her growing relationship with Isabel really improves Rachel. Like all of us, she responds to the sunshine of someone else's attention. And so she has increasing amounts of clarity as well as madness. as the play progresses. And it's really interesting for me to feel where those are from night to night. This is a play that I think you could do for a long time and find new things all the time. It's like looking into a rock pool. The longer you look, the more you see.
Mm-hmm. And what do you hope that people will take away from it? Because obviously it was written in the 80s. So how much it was a response to also the very particular, you know, context that existed then. But then there's lots of themes that are completely, you know, relevant today about how we kind of treat women, how we kind of, you know, like some of the things you're mentioning, you know, how we like write off, you know, a loud woman or is hysterical or, you know, not in control of her emotions, and how we imprison women as well. I think, you know, the prisons are being expanded as we speak. So, you know, what do you think some of the themes are that could be relevant to an audience today?
Well, exactly those. And as you touch on, you know, women go to prison for first offences that are much more trivial than the offences for which many men go to prison. I think, yes, you will see perhaps some shifts in attitude between 1732, 3, 4, 5, when this play is set, and now, and so we should, but there are some things which really haven't changed very much. Mainly, it's a really good story. And I hope that although Rachel can be quite overwhelming, the essential sweetness of the other three characters and the bursts of sunshine to which Rachel is also prone will make it worth your while coming to see this play. It's a fascinating story, and I think that Sue has done a really good job of getting it on a stage.
And how does it feel to be back on the stage? Because maybe now it feels like, you know, ages ago that we all locked down and all the theatres were shut, or maybe it still feels quite recent. I know I haven't been to the theatre that many times since things reopened. Is that still that feeling of electricity, you know, oh my gosh, we're back on stage, we're back in a room, able to appreciate theatre together again?
Well, from my point of view, yes, I do feel that, because it's sort of, that's the big thing about theatre, isn't it? It's time outside time. People come in away from the kind of quotidian cares of their day and hope to be transported somewhere else. And it's our job to go on that journey with them. And at its very best, theatre can be absolutely transcendent. It's very exciting to be back. I'm glad to know that at 62, I can still learn the lines and get them out of me in the order in which they were written, and that it is a thrilling thing to do. Sometimes you'll probably have noticed that Arifa Akbar in The Guardian today is rebutting Viola Davis's suggestion that critics are pointless. The bottom line is, I'd always rather be doing my job than hers. It's a really exciting job to do. And I feel really lucky to be able to do it.
And looking back over your career, what have been some of the highlights for you? And, you know, what are your ambitions for what you might do next?
I'd like to stave off what I'm going to call the samovar years for as long as I possibly can, you know, where I have to stand behind a samovar pouring cups of tea and looking grateful. I'd really like to stave that off for as long as I can. But who knows? I mean, I'm very fortunate. When I first started out, all I wanted to be able to do was to get better at my job and to be able to support myself. And I have been able to do that for 40 years, which is not in, you know, you can't do that without a lot of luck. Yes, it's not all based on luck, but luck is an enormous part of it. And if my luck runs out at the end of this run, I have to put my hands up and say, fair enough, I had a good go at it.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing all that with us. And can't wait for everyone else to have the chance to come and see The Straw Chair at Finborough Theatre.
Thank you very much.
Lovely to speak to you, Siobhán. See you. Enjoy the rest of your evening.